This is the basis of light and shadow as well as simple form. It's something you got to know. It's something you're going to use all the time. It's not my theory, but this is Leonardo da Vinci's theory that to ideally show form, it should be 2/3 light, 1/3 shadow, with the light positioned so that it's coming from, if you're right-handed, the upper left. So here's the light coming in from the upper left, and here is going to be your sphere. I say sphere in this case and not circle because what you have to think is dimensionally. A circle's flat, it's a shape. And right now this basically could be called just a shape. But what you really want to think is that it's something that's round, that it has, if it was a globe, this would be like the longitude and latitude. Okay, what happens is the first thing you do is you divide the form into light and shadow. You want 2/3 light, 1/3 shadow. Because the light's coming this way, at this kind of an angle, whatever surface this is resting on is going to cast a shadow as well. And that would correspond to the direction of the light. When you first think of light and shadow, you take your shadows and you think of them as one and the same, meaning the cast shadow and the shadow area in general at first are seen as one, same value. So try to keep your strokes without a lot of strokes in them. Keep them very, in fact you can do this if you want to smooth them out. Okay, now you got to separate the main shadow area from the cast shadow. Remember, the cast shadow is what's lying, say this ball is on a table. So the cast shadow starts at its source with a very hard, dark edge, and as it moves away from what's ever causing the shadow to happen, it becomes diffuse. So again, darkest right under the form, hardest edge right here. Back here, this is a diffused edge, soft. Okay, the shadow itself has two main elements to it. The true shadow, which is in the center, and something called the reflected light in shadow. Reflected light in shadow happens when light hits the surface that the form is resting on. In this case, the ball is resting on a table, and bounces light back into the shadow. The reflected light is never as light as anything in the light. It's part of the shadow group. You have to think of it as part of the shadow group so that it doesn't get confused with the light area. Now, we're drawing on white paper, so basically the white paper is going to serve as the general light area. But between light and shadow, or if you think of it as like night and day, there's twilight. And twilight is called the halftone. This only happens on rounded objects because it's a transition. And it's very important in drawing and particularly in painting, how you handle the halftone. Again, I'm just going to smudge it out to make it look more like a transition. By the way, if you notice with the reflected light, the darkest part of the shadow, the true shadow, this is darker because this is where more light is bouncing into. The light can't bounce up to this area as well, so this tends to be darker. Okay, I'm going to write down just to review. This is the cast shadow. This is the true shadow. This is the reflected light. In the shadow. And this area here is the halftone. Okay, and the last thing, all this area obviously is the light. And then, right about where the top plane and the front plane come together, you're going to get a highlight. Everyone tends to know the highlight because it's that shiny white area that people love to put in. So we'll call that the highlight. Okay, so this is your basic Leonardo's. This is the ground plane, by the way, so that's actually sitting on something. So this is Leonardo's theory of light and shadow. Now, we turn to a cube. Why a cube? Because this actually has planes that are easily seen and no halftone. When you draw a cube in this position, by the way, notice that all these that are in one direction are parallel, and in other words, this is parallel to this is parallel to that. Makes it a lot easier. If you should practice drawing this, because basically anything that looks three-dimensional should be able to fit into a cube of one type or another. So again, the main light is coming from the left. So now this is the shadow side. Now there is some reflected light. It's just minor, but it's bouncing off the surface. Depending on the material the cube is made out of, you would get more reflected light or no reflected light. If it was cardboard, probably none. But it's bouncing off the table or whatever surface. If this was a building, this would be the side plane of a building. Now, again, here's the angle of the light. By the way, when I draw the angle, I'm looking at that to try and duplicate the same result. It's going to cast a shadow. Again, the cast shadow is starting very hard and dark and diffusing as it moves away from its source. Okay, this is the top plane. Now this is white paper, but technically speaking, very lightly, and I'll change pencils so hopefully it'll work. The top plane is going to be getting the most light, depending if the light is kind of more above. So the front plane is a slightly darker tone, let's put it that way. Okay, so you got, and by the way, here's your hardest edge right here. Also, right here, where the planes intersect. There's no highlights unless it's a shiny cube, but really there's no highlights and there's no halftone at all. Okay, the next simple shape we're going to do is the cylinder. Okay, first when you draw a cylinder, draw the center line. It's important. When you draw a center line, I'm looking at the side of my paper to angle up how vertical it actually is, because you don't want it tilted. Okay, now I'm going to say, oh right, it's about this wide. Double check it from here to here. This is an ellipse. Ellipse is a circle in space. Now you drop down the sides of the cylinder, and because you're like looking more, you're looking lower, well, you're above it looking down on the cylinder, so there's more of a curve on the lower part relative to the horizon line. This, by the way, is not the horizon line. This is the edge of the table. We'll get into perspective in a different video. This is just as if it's sitting on a tabletop. Now, again, just like with the like we had covered with the sphere, you're going to want 2/3 light, 1/3 shadow. Light coming this way. When I say this way, by the way, I mean it's as if it's hitting like this, dimensionally. So its cast shadow is going to go out this way, and as it moves away from its source, it gets darker and more diffused. I mean, it gets lighter and more diffused. I got confused. So, and here's the shadow. Now the difference, of course, is going to be a halftone. But there's another interesting thing that happens in the halftone. When you draw on white paper, the halftone is always considered to be part of the shadow. When you paint, it can be either part of the shadow or part of the light, depending, but you have to do it consistently, depending on what it is you decide. I usually put it as part of the shadow, but let's pretend this is made of wood. The texture, all the shadow doesn't want any detail, because your eye either can look in the light or it can look in the shadow. But your eye prefers the light, and so if it looks at the light, it's not looking at the shadow, and the shadow should be simple. That's why I'm taking all the texture out by smudging of the shadows. However, the halftone has the texture. So as it comes around the bend meaning as the form is turning, all these little crevices, again this is a wooden cylinder, start catching, they have some shadow in them as you come out of the shadow area. The halftone eventually gets less and less, and because it's a cylinder and because you have this rough texture, when you reach the side towards the light, as it swings around this way, you're going to again get very, very slight texture picking up. So the halftone equals texture in drawing and painting. Okay? And technically, if you were like to really continue this out and over detail it, you'd still leave this area pretty white. And the reason is because this would be the highlight area. Wood doesn't create much of a highlight, but this would be the highlight. If it was a shiny cylinder, like say this one, you would get a lot of, pretend it was metal actually, because that's highly reflective, so you would get a lot of bounced light into the reflected light area. Sometimes it can be almost as bright as the light area depending on the type of metal, but much brighter. A little bit darker towards the top again because it's bouncing off the table, and here's the basic shadow area, getting darker where it comes up against. So metal is a highly reflective surface, and what's going to also happen when you do metal is it's going to be reflecting things that are off to the side, meaning things that exist off here. So very often you get secondary areas of darkness. Now if this was in a full value, you'd still get the really bright highlight down the center. So I'm going to just tone everything to leave a bright area in the center. Okay, so now you have more of like a metal looking cylinder. Hopefully. Okay. And the same thing, by the way, if it had been a sphere, real typical, like say a hubcap one of those baby moon hubcaps, it'll reflect, and you'll get a much harder edge to the shadow area. Should have mentioned that with the cylinder. You don't get much transition between light and shadow. Sometimes you'll get like things that it picks up and that kind of stuff. Oh, okay. Okay. Concerning light sources, let's draw a sphere with the light source directly overhead. So here's the sphere, and what's going to happen is, instead of the traditional, you're going to end up with the shadow being totally under, and the top plane being lit, and the cast shadow, of course, extends only as far as what's blocking it from the light. Overhead lighting we'll cover more when we do heads and how to light the head different ways. You will get reflected light, so where, notice I'm darkening the true shadow, and that creates the illusion of reflected light in the shadow. It makes the sphere appear more lit up. Okay, now we'll do backlighting, which is if you have a sphere and the light is like coming from, you have to kind of picture this, is coming from behind it. So the edge, now this isn't quite edge lighting, this is more backlighting. So think of like the planes. Here's the top plane, here's a front plane, here's the side plane, but you're going kind of against the form, and the shadow that it casts will project towards you, because again, the light is back here somewhere. And that's called backlighting. By the way, this would look a lot better if you also darken the background. It'll look more like it's being lit from above. It's very dramatic lighting when it's front lighting. Okay, then for pure side lighting, that's when it's actually coming this way. You would get the sphere lit with very little under shadow, and the shadow would go straight out. Okay.